being attacked.
And then
from
that was
all
like
around.
what, 16 years ago now, right?
It was, yes.
Yeah. But you know, the admirable thing is that you were able to overcome that and now switch your focus over to the patients there. So to tell me about that.
So I would, after I kind of assessed, because I had to know for myself to see what I thought the walls would do, what the windows would do. And then I just, at that point, just reassured the patients, the nurses, had, friendships with some of them that, hey, things are going to be okay. This is concrete wall. These are concrete walls. These windows seem thick enough to hold. Let's just keep doing what we need to do and stay safe. Let me know if you need something. And so I just, again, talked to several people. And at that point, my shift was over. So I went back down to the pharmacy, and there's a small storage room in the back, a dark room. I remember getting a 3-liter, a 2-liter bag, and just used that as a pillow. And a
2-liter bag, you mean like an IV solution, right?
That's right. I'm sorry.
Okay.
2-liter bag of IV solution, and used that as a pillow, and finally went to bed after working a night shift.
Yeah. And what, were you able to get any sleep that night?
I could still, even though we were inside the basement, inside a central area, I could still hear and feel, the weather outside. But I did at one point finally pass out and go to bed.
Sure. I'm sure you were mentally exhausted, right? And physically too.
And I was, absolutely.
Yeah. So at some point, the hospital went on lockdown.
It did, yes. So when that team initially came on board, they told us that at this point, no one can come into or leave the building.
The hospital building.
The
Nobody
hospital
can
building.
come in or leave.
That's right.
Okay.
So when you start and end your shifts, you don't leave like normal people would and go home. You're there and you're locked down. And so, and that's why I slept on the floor there in that back storage room.
So to create a timeline, the hurricane started on August 29th, 2005.
So I love this question because you're right. Hurricane Katrina hit and was documented to have hit on August 29th, 2005. But really the significant impacts of the storm started the day before.
The day before.
And so this shift that I worked really was on the 28th. And this much destruction and the weather events was happening even prior what they would document as the eye wall crossing or the eye hitting the land.
So that's like the storm before the storm, so to speak.
The storm is so large, it just has that much power. So even 12 hours before it officially the eye wall crosses, you're still being hit by hurricane force winds, and then it's category 1, then category 2, then category 3 sustained winds for hours.
So it's almost like when we have an earthquake, you have the aftershocks, but with a hurricane, it's like the before, the pre-shocks in a way, right? Or there's all this going on that is like the prelude to the actual hurricane.
Right. Well, yeah, and I like the comparison with a tornado. We see tornadoes here in Texas and the destruction that it can cause. A hurricane is like a sustained tornado, where a tornado goes through and wipes everything out. With that type of wind, a hurricane is sustained winds that high. And with Katrina being as large as it is, it's like being walked over by a tornado for constant time.
Right. Huh. So what? Going back to the hospital being on lockdown, had you ever been in a situation like that where the hospital had to go on lockdown?
I have because let me think. For that same year, we had a scenario where we had to have teams, and at that time, you typically work a full 24-hour shift, and you plan to be there for a day. But you go home, there's a lockdown, but once the storm passes, you're able to just go to your car and drive home.
Okay, so there was never a lockdown that happened to this degree?
Never to this degree.
Okay.
Because what happened is, I went to bed and I remember waking up. But yeah, once you woke up, you could see the amount of destruction there. And the city as a whole was on a sustained lockdown where they wanted people to shelter in place because they knew it wasn't safe to travel the streets. And yeah.
And also it wasn't safe to travel the streets because of looting and those kind of things were taking place too at this time, right?
The looting didn't really start until a few days after, a few days further in. But you're right, that is a safety factor to consider, and that was happening. but that really started happening days after when people really realized they weren't getting help. And so, of course, you'll have looters take advantage of situations or people take advantage of situations maybe early on, but really the looting got bad when people really recognized they had to fend for themselves.
Right, right. And then the looting was a contributing factor for martial law to take place. But before we get into that, tell me what it looked like in the hospital. I think, the water was actually coming into the hospital and you had to make some heroic moves to save medications and, to really help out the patients that were there. Right. So yeah, tell us about that. That's
right. So this was observed. I finally, went to bed after that first shift. I woke up and I remember the storm passed. Thank God we survived the storm. And I remember walking out into the street initially when I woke up from that nap, from working the night shift, and I could touch the streets. I remember touching the ground, but seeing the destruction. Everything was just demolished around. And then as I was preparing to start working my second night shift, you can start to see water entering into the streets. And I didn't know what that was about. I thought maybe there was a broken sewer main, or maybe, something was creating just some local flooding. And so as I got situated into my chair back in the pharmacy on generator power, I get a call from the ER that said, "Hey, Pradeep, there is something going on and there's water starting to rise in the streets. And at this time, night has fallen and it's just dark outside." So I remember walking down to the ER, looking outside that ambulance bay, and you could see that there was a coating of water everywhere.
And was this before the lockdown or prior to the lockdown or after the lockdown?
We were still on lockdown.
You're still on lockdown?
We're still on lockdown. The lockdown really started right before the storm hit.
Okay.
Because people recognize that you're here to stay for this event.
Oh, I see.
And so they didn't, typically they would have released us from lockdown by the time the storm passes, but they told us at this point, you're still on lockdown. We can't bring in the other team to relieve you. So just continue working these shifts until we find out more information.
Right, because they can't get anybody in and nobody can go out. There's no place to go, right?
That's right.
Okay. So you see the water rising.
That's right. See the water rising and, I had to go back to my seat and started working away. And then I get another phone call to help out. The water was rising to the point where they felt like they had to move some of the medication machines there in the ER. So I helped with that. I helped push out some of the machines that are in some of the ER rooms there.
And these are machines hooked up to electricity and the water is rising.
That's right.
Yeah, that's a scary scenario.
Yes. Rationale would tell you not to touch that, but
right.
Then when you see the big picture, that we recognize these machines, these medications need to be preserved. We're just doing what we need to do for the patients.
That's amazing. That's amazing. So I'm trying to picture this. So the pharmacy, the ER, everything that was on the first floor, and the water is rising now.
It is.
So you have to move these machines, medications out, and where did you take them?
We were hopeful. We pushed them into like a room where we can, kind of sandbag, if you will, or kind of protect them.
Mm-hmm.
So we just brought them to an area where we felt like we could kind of preserve them a little bit more.
Okay.
And little did we know the water would just keep on rising. So that was almost a futile effect.
And are the elevators even working at this point, or?
When the generators kicked on, the elevators stopped working.
Wow.
And it was eerie walking by the elevators because not only were they not working, during the storm, you could feel all the pressure in there, and then you can hear water dripping through the elevator well. So you knew you didn't want those doors to open for the elevator because it just sounded like it was out of commission, and it was, there was, obvious leaks happening inside there.
Right.
So that wasn't an option. So everything was through the stairwells.
Wow. Okay. And there's patients on all these floors, right?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. So I remember walking from that ER back into the pharmacy to just keep doing my role there. And I walked into the IV room to make an IV. At nighttime, it's a skeleton crew. Mm-hmm. So I was one of maybe two pharmacists there, if that, and there's a pharmacy tech or two that was there. And I walked into the IV room, which is in the back of the pharmacy, and I started seeing water seeping in through the back IV room door that typically leads into another hallway. And so that's when I realized this water is rising faster than I thought. And I started then trying to even reach out to my leadership just to get a hold of them, but it was just communication was down everywhere. So
Yeah, I could only imagine what were phones even working at this point, even cell phones or landlines, anything like that?
they were down.
They were all down.
They were all down.
So there's no way to communicate with the outside world.
That's correct.
Wow.
That's correct. So we could try to call internally, and even then, it's not like we're in a hotel suite where you dial a room number for getting in contact with people. And so really, I just I had to then just make decisions at that point. I gathered the farm techs, whoever we had there, and we started moving medications out from the IV room. We had to start making decisions for what was on the shelves on what we need to start saving. And what we used for transportation is we had these big, large garbage cans, like you see maybe for recycling. These big, large square cans in the IV rooms that we would put trash and different things in. We emptied that out, and we started using that to just basically run the shelves and start putting in medications that we knew patients would need.
Right. So yeah. So you had to dump everything from the shelves, all the medications, those things into this, what usually would be like a waste bin or something.
That's exactly right.
Wow. Okay.
And we can't fit all the medications that are there. It's a large hospital, a large pharmacy. So we really had to make some strategic decisions on what we kind of knew patients would use. Because I was doing order entry, I had a feeling for medications that they were actively on, and so we just were pulling whatever medications we knew the patients would need over the next several days. And once we filled the bin, we dragged that. At this point, the water was now coming higher into the pharmacy. We drag it out to the nearest stairwell and start pulling it up the stairwell one step at a time.
Yeah, I can only imagine how heavy it must have been too, right?
That's right. And then your feet are wet, and it's you're wet, your shoes are wet, and It just was step by step. But you also had a sense of urgency, so it was just a race of time.
I can only imagine just that adrenaline flowing, right? And then
right.
Because you literally have lives in your hands that are at stake.
Exactly.
The patients, right?
That's right. Exactly. And then there was just a lot of things to consider. When you get up there, having it secured. So I remember making a run to the top, getting some of those medications secured and running back down into the pharmacy. And then the water was higher. It was not at my ankles anymore. It was now halfway, up my leg. And at that point, I could see it was right at the point where it's touching the refrigerators that are plugged in, which are heavy duty, industrial refrigerators and chemo refrigerators. And it was just, again, another decision to make. Do you walk into this room with all this electricity plugged in? And,
Right. I mean, you could have been electrocuted at any moment.
That's right.
Wow. And to get a kind of idea of how big this hospital medical center is, how many floors was that? Or is it?
It's one of the larger ones in the city.
Yeah, and just a guesstimate. I know, it's probably hard to know exactly.
I would say at least about 10 floors.
At least 10 floors. Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's a big building.
It is.
Right.
It is. And this hospital did a lot of specialty service lines that are not commonly done in that region. And so there was a lot of medications, a lot of sick patients there. They had children, pediatrics there, big children, kids there.
And is it Tulane Medical Center? Is that also a teaching facility?
It is.
It is, right? So
it is.
So okay. So it's big.
It's big, and you have and so you have a lot of clinical services there, and so we just continued to empty out the pharmacy, and we had to set up a pharmacy on a different floor. But I also wanted to share when we were pulling out. I remember when I came out of the pharmacy again into the corridor before I started moving more medications up, I was seeing fruit floating down the hallway coming from the cafeteria. And now there was enough water on the first floor where all these items were just floating down the hallway, things that you would never expect to see.
Wow. And this isn't fruit floating in clean water. This is toxic water, poisonous water.
That's right.
Can you tell us about that?
Yes, it's, if you've seen the Mississippi River in New Orleans, that will give you a sense. They call it the mighty Mississippi, but they also call it the muddy Mississippi. And you take that type of, brackish brown water and you combine it with all the sewage that is there in the streets, right? That's being piped underneath, along with chemicals and oils. There's refineries. That's all in that area along the Mississippi River. It was just some really unfriendly water, just brown. It had a certain smell. You can just tell that this was some unhealthy water to be in.
Wow. So it's mixing with soup